So welcome, folks. I know I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces here, which is excellent. I love that we've got a little community going and some folks that are really seeing a lot of benefit in joining us every Wednesday. And this webinar series does run until that May 2-4 weekend, that elusive May 2-4 weekend that we're all working towards. However, there's been some discussion about, in fact, keeping it going all summer. So we haven't decided yet, and if with vacation and folks wanting to be out in their growing space, we're not sure, but certainly we have a lot more topics coming over the next couple of months. And today's topic is really going to be some hands-on skills around planning your growing space. And we've spent a few weeks talking about the different factors that influence those. And today we're really going to start getting down to brass tacks, and we're going to run through a case study example of how it works, so that you can then hopefully for your homework take a stab at it yourself. So we'll start with some quick intros. We do have time today for anybody that wants to say hello. We'll quickly review a few key points from the last weeks, and also hear if anyone took a shot at doing their homework around seed starting. And we are going to then, of course, be talking about your garden and your grow space layout, followed as always by we have a special discount offer, we have some homework, and then at the end we always have time for question and answer. So if a question comes to mind, please drop it in the chat. Kat will be monitoring that. If it's straightforward or she has easy access to a resource that would help you, she'll reply in the chat as well. Otherwise, she'll line us up for the questions at the end of the webinar. So for those of you who would like to say hello today, what you're going to do is use the smiley face emoji at the bottom of your Zoom program. You're going to click on that, and there will be a hand. And that is going to show as putting up your hand. And you'll have a chance, about 30 seconds or less, to introduce yourself. Today, I want to know what new type of plant you are going to try for the first time growing, whether it's indoors or outdoors. And if you were here last week and you want to talk about the homework, then now's your opportunity as well. So if anybody would like to speak up, certainly it's not required, but you can just throw your hand up in the air there, and we will we'll call on you. Looks like we've got a little bit more of an intimate group here today, and so maybe folks aren't as keen to speak up, which is totally fine. We do have lots of oh nope, Suzanne, thank you, Suzanne. We got one there. Thank you, Suzanne. So Suzanne, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and say hello.
Hi everybody. Hi, Jocelyn. I was one of the things I'd like to grow this year, and you were talking about it already, is bok choy. And I wouldn't know where to begin. So I'm in the right place.
Okay. For sure. Yeah. And actually that's going to dovetail really nicely with what we're talking about today. And I personally love growing bok choy. So I'll give you all my secrets, and I'm sure everyone will benefit from that. So thank you, Suzanne. That's great.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And was there I think that was that it for hands? I think that was it.
There's one more, Judy.
Oh, Judy, great. Okay. Judy, please unmute yourself and you can go ahead. Do we have Judy? I'm not seeing Judy listed. Kat, do you see her?
Yep, I saw her with her hand up, but maybe, and I saw her unmute, but now she's back on mute. Oh, she says she can't unmute, or it won't do it on her end. Okay, let me try to do that.
Okay, all right. We're having some A/B challenges, which is pretty par for the course. These days, we're all used to that. While we're working on getting Judy online, anybody else quickly want to introduce themselves? Or oh, we've got some more raised hands. For some reason, I can't actually see who has raised their hand. But Kat,
Sue.
perhaps you can.
Yeah.
Sue. Oh, Sue Till. Awesome. Hi, Sue. How's it going? You can unmute.
Hello. Yeah, I actually bought so many new seeds and so many new berry bushes. So this morning I was actually like, I'm trying to do the edible landscaping thing, and this morning I was actually Googling companion plants, and it's like my brain's gonna explode with like, this goes with that, but that doesn't go with that, but that does go with that. So I really appreciate today. Thanks.
Cool. That's awesome. Well, yeah, no, it's so exciting to get all your new seed packs, and also really fun that you're planting some perennial bushes. That is definitely exciting and a good fit. So I'm going to give you sort of the exact way that I do my growing plant, and it does help with that overwhelm or sort of figuring out how to get yourself set up for success. So I think what we'll do is we'll keep going, because I'm going to keep an eye on the time and we have so much to cover today. So the homework was from last week, which was really around starting your seeds. And so I'll just use this as a quick reminder that once we have our growing space plan after today, you will be then in a position to start some of your seeds based on the ones that you need earliest for the spring, and as well on how long it takes to germinate. So best practice reminder that you do want to have lots of space and lots of light if you're starting your own seeds. Otherwise, you are going to be ultimately making things more challenging for yourself in the long run. So I always find it's important to start these sessions, especially because they are about regenerative growing, around this idea that plants and soil microbes really depend on each other to grow healthy and strong. And ultimately, when we talk about regenerative growing, we're talking about this idea that year after year or season after season, the work that we're doing with the plants, with the soil, with the ecosystem is actually continuously improving it, and it's getting better and better year in, year out. And of course, that is in contrast to chemical or conventional agriculture that degrades our ecosystem every season. So the key here is that the microbes are the ones that are ultimately responsible for this regeneration. And the way that happens, or the analogy I always give, is that the microbes are like the pizza delivery boy of the soil. And the plants and the microbes have a special language they communicate with. And the plant essentially, calls up the pizza delivery boy and asks for a very specific type of pizza based on what their needs are at that particular moment. Plants are very smart. They know what they're missing. They know what they need next to be healthy and strong. And so long as they can call up and actually get a hold of that particular pizza boy with the right type of pizza, then the pizza delivery guy will go out much farther than the roots could ever reach. They'll find those nutrients that have been requested. They'll make that particular type of pizza, and then they'll bring it back to the plant's root system, hand it over, and in exchange, the plant provides a tip. It's a type of valuable tip. It's a carbohydrate sugar tip that the pizza delivery microbe can then use. They will then consume that to grow stronger. And what happens over time is that because the plant is receiving the correct on-demand nutrients, it grows bigger and healthier and is able to do more photosynthesis, which in turn allows for more of that sugar carbohydrate to travel down to the root system, be released into the soil, and feed the microbial communities that are existing there. So the key here is that every microbe has a very niche role to play. And it's only if the right type of microbe is ready and waiting that the plant can get exactly the type of nutrients it needs. Therefore, we always want to be working with a soil that has as much microbial diversity as possible to ensure whatever that plant needs, whenever it needs it, it's going to be able to access it by working with its plant microbial partners. There's also other benefits to planting groups of plants together. Of course, they're going to be sharing microbes, and they will, in fact, communicate with each other through this microbiology, and that is really fundamental in terms of them being able to warn each other if there's an impending pathogen attack, or if perhaps that there is going to be a need for an additional special kind of nutrient. They are in fact able to share resources under the soil through the efforts of the microbiology. But there's also other really good reasons for this term, which we call companion planting, or really picking and choosing where and which plants are going to go together. And one of them is pest control. So certain types of plants are able to actually naturally deter specific types of insects. And so this is often, there's a number of flowers that it's recommended that you always try to have in your growing space. And then you can always search out specific types of flowers or other plants that can help if you have a particular pest problem. The diversity of having different plants planted together increases that overall spectrum, which is so important. And it's certain plants are able to replenish particular nutrients. We often talk about the legume family. So we have our beans and our peas. And this type of particular plant has a very particular special relationship with mycorrhizal fungi that in fact allows it to work. The mycorrhizal fungi will actually move inside the root systems of these legume plants and become one with that plant to convert unavailable nitrogen into the correct format, or the bioavailable format that the plant uses. And that is a really valuable tool that particular class of plants has. And in regenerative growing, it is one of the techniques that we use, especially if we're running low on nitrogen in our soil. Plants also can provide physical characteristics that help improve our yields or our growing space. So a classic example, which we see here, is the three sisters. And on the Three Sisters is a traditional indigenous group of plants that are planted together. And what it is our it's our squash, and then we have our corn. And Kat, I'm forgetting what the third one is. Can you help me out here?
The beans climb
the
up.
beans, of course. Thank you. Of course, the beans. So the beans are the legumes, and they're the ones that are providing all the nitrogen, because corn is a heavy feeder. So there are certain types of plants, corn, tomato, cannabis, squash, that are considered heavy feeders, which means that they need a lot of nitrogen in their particular growing medium. And one way to do this naturally without the use of chemical fertilizers is to ensure that nearby, close by, there are types of the legume family. So in this case, how it works is that at the beginning of the season, these three crops are planted in a little hill. And over the course of the season, the corn will grow up. First, it comes up quickly, and it actually acts as a trellis. And so this is one of the really cool things about this pairing or this match, is that as the corn grows up, the beans then can use that corn stalk as a trellis, and they will also wind their way up the corn stalk to get the favorable conditions that they need. At the same time, the squash, which is more of a low-lying plant and gets really big leaves and it likes to spread out as wide as possible. It is also a heavy feeder, but what's really cool is that squash plants have spikes on them. So if you've ever accidentally grabbed a vine of a squash plant, you'll feel that they are in fact quite spiky. And so this serves as a wonderful protective mechanism, because if you've ever tried to grow corn, whether you're urban, suburban, or rural, it is incredibly difficult. You know, your corn is like, okay, tomorrow it's going to be ready. I'm going to pick it tomorrow. And sure enough, you come back tomorrow and the raccoons beat you to it. So this is really a beautiful solution that you know, ultimately taking advantage of Mother Nature's natural protective mechanisms, whereby that squash plant is going to hopefully keep that corn away from any predators. So there's lots of different reasons that you do want to look at how and which plants you're pairing together. Of course, a plant can also provide shade. So that allows you, if you are in a position where you have a lot of full sun, lucky you, but some cool weather crops you can grow by growing them under bigger, larger plants. And as we talked about in previous sessions, they provide a ton of benefits in terms of keeping your soil covered and also helping to prevent that soil from being exposed to the natural elements. So we want to get into exactly how we go about setting up our grow space. So this slide's really an overview of things we've talked about in the past. So if you are new in the group, I would suggest that you take a screen cap of this, or however, we are now making these sessions available after the fact. So if you would like to watch it later on, it will be up and available on our website. So you'll be able to see it then. So these are some things that you want to assess when you're looking at your growing space. And so to really get started, what I always suggest is that you look at a good long list of the different fruits and vegetables that are out there. And for the most part, we are going to be talking about outdoor growing and food growing, because I'm especially passionate about the benefits of regenerative agriculture in growing healthy food that is scientifically proven to have more vitamins, have more metabolites, have more of the healthy nutrients that we want versus food that isn't grown regeneratively. But we do, at the end, I've got a slide for indoor plants as well. So first step, you want to look at this list, and certainly it's not extensive, but what I'd like you to do is come up with a list of your 4 or 5 or 6 favorite plants, favorite foods. And the reason we do it in this way is that you really want to be growing things that you can put to use. And there's nothing worse than growing something, only putting a lot of effort into it, only to then find out you don't really like the taste very much. So one thing I've had to learn the hard way is that even though eggplants are really fun to grow, we have a little hoop house and they really grow well in that sort of tropical climate, and they're beautiful and there's so many different varieties, I really don't like eggplants. And, you know, I just haven't found a way to cook them where I actually enjoy them. So what happens is, you know, they either just get left on the vine to rot, or I do harvest them and then I freeze them. And then ultimately, years later, I've still got these frozen bags of mush eggplant. So I've learned, stay away from the eggplant, Jocelyn, focus on things you actually like to eat. So for today's case study, I picked a fairly common set. So we're going to be looking at how we would incorporate growing tomatoes, cauliflower, which is a type of brassica plant, winter squash, which if you're not familiar with this term, so when it comes to squash, there's 2 categories or classifications. There is summer squash, which the layperson term would be zucchini. So summer squash essentially means the same as zucchini. or some people would call it a courgette, perhaps if you're from overseas. And winter squash, however, is what we consider typically squash and pumpkins. So these are squash plants, and the difference really is that your summer squash you harvest in late summer into the early fall, whereas with your winter squash you actually leave them in place until after the first frost. And that's because you want your winter squash to get a hard exterior coating. So we're talking things like a Hubbard squash. And these are actually storage squash crops. So they stay out longer, they get a hard outer shell. And that's really what then allows us to be able to store them in, for example, a cold room for months to get us through the winter. I put watermelon on there because it's sort of a fun crop to grow, although frankly I haven't had a ton of success personally. Cucumbers, so yummy, so easy, and garlic as well, because there's some unique properties about garlic that make it a good addition to a lot of gardens. So the next step, after you have your list of 4 or 5 primary crops, as I call them, then what I want you to do is to sketch out the rough shapes of your growing space. So for this example, we decided that we use a 3 garden bed layout. So we could say, for example, that these are 3 foot wide by, let's say, 10 foot long grow beds. And you want to pencil in some of the key microclimate factors that are going to influence what kind of conditions each of those beds receive. So, nothing super intensive here, but so a few key points. So on the left side of the screen, you'll see at the top of bed 1, we have a deciduous tree. And it is important to note because a coniferous tree, like a pine tree, is going to be shady, but perhaps dappled shade through your entire growing season. A deciduous tree, like a maple tree, is going to not provide much shade at all in the spring, but certainly by the summer and into the fall, it's going to provide quite a lot of shade because of that dense foliage. Excuse me. So we know that for bed 1 in the spring, we're getting full sun, but then for summer and then into the fall, we're only getting partial shade in that bed. This is, of course, in contrast to bed 3, which is where our southerly sun is coming from, and we're getting lots of hot, sunny light for bed 3. I also made a note of the slope, so we can assume that in this case bed 1 is higher than bed 2, which is higher than bed 3, which means that moisture or water drainage is going to be moving from the area of highest elevation to lowest elevation, and ultimately bed 1 is going to be drier, or at least we could say it has better drainage than bed 3. So the next step for planning your grow space is to consider and try and reflect back, if you didn't make any notes, as to what grew in which of those spaces last year. And after you make this mistake once, you tend to not make the mistake again, and that is not actually keeping records of what you grew. So you're trying to think back. So do the best you can. But you would want to sort of pencil in where and what was grown, and if parts of the bed, only parts of the bed were used. So in bed 1 last year, we can assume that we were growing amaranth, carrots, potatoes, and then we probably had a cover crop of oats and peas. And the bottom half of that bed was garlic. In the middle, we have squash, zucchini, cucumbers. And at the bottom, we have those heat-loving peppers. And on the right side, of course, we planted our sunflowers as close to the sun as possible, eggplants, which are heat lovers as well, strawberries, and then the tomatoes, which are also considered a sun and heat-loving crop. So this is where things start to get a little bit more intense, if you will. And let me assure you that the first year you do this, it is a bit overwhelming, and there's a lot of variables, and you do the best you can, and then it is really the type of thing that every year that you do it, you get better at it. And it's not only because you're keeping better notes, but you also you better learn your growing space, the unique microclimates, and also you simply are better acquainted with the different crops, the different vegetables, so that you're not always having to look up your information about each one. But that would be a really, really key point to make, is that at this point, if you are going to be growing any new crops or crops that you aren't particularly familiar with, you would want to do some research, and you want to find out some of the key best practices around growing that particular plant. What conditions does it like? What soil does it like? How long does it take to go from planting to harvest? Does it need to be direct seeded, or are you okay to start the seeds inside and then transplant it at the right time? And are there any particular plants that it really likes to be partnered with, or any particular plants that it absolutely hates being partnered with? And then also this idea of if it's a heavy feeder. And those are all really important things to know for each of the types of plants that you're growing. So what I've done, what I do with my chart here is for the columns, I set up each discrete growing space. So here, and then I'll put a few notes about what's important. So as you'll remember from the previous slide, we had our first bed with some partial sun, but good drainage, our full bed number 2, and then we have our full sun bed number 3, but we know that moisture can tend to collect down there. So then in terms of the rows, I do want to start with a first row that indicates what was grown there last year. Now, if you're really advanced, you actually may include things like the past few years, what was grown there. And for those who are really committed to regenerative practices and cycling their crops and have the space to do that, which not everyone does, often they're actually on a 3 or even 5-year crop rotation plan. So you can imagine that takes a lot of foresight and planning. So it's certainly not necessary. So really you can adapt this tool to whatever level of experience and resources and in fact space that you have available to you. All right, so now we're going to start slotting in our crops. So now this is important again to appreciate that it's a little bit of a game of Tetris, or you need to, let's use pencil. Let's say you're going to start by using pencil because it's one of those practices where you start, you put a few in, and then you start realizing that, oh no, this should have gone there, that should have gone there, and so you're erasing and rewriting. That is totally normal. In fact, that's part of the process. And that is ultimately what we're trying to do here, is create some structure for ourselves, create some constraints, and create some priorities in terms of how are we going to choose which of our plants go where. So I started with tomatoes for a few reasons. I love tomatoes and the more the merrier. So I always try to prioritize them in our garden. Also, there's so many different varieties of tomatoes. So really having some good space for them to grow is important. As well, tomatoes do not like to be planted too close together. I've tried that and, tried to save space, but ultimately did not work out well. They need lots of airflow. And so for their leaves, they need to dry out. And so that's why I like to put my tomatoes in first. They are, of course, a heat-loving crop. So I did want to put them somewhere that is full sun. And they actually do require quite a bit of water. So again, I wasn't too concerned, even though the leaves and the stems need to be able to dry off quickly after they get wet. The roots will in fact absorb a lot of water, and in fact, you're going to have some really ripe, juicy tomatoes as a result. So the one thing to note here is that last year we had tomatoes in the bottom section of bed 3. So I've specifically chosen to put them in the top section of bed 3 this year so as to not have them grow in the same location. Now, if this isn't possible, there are other ways to compensate for it. But if and when it is possible, the regenerative best practice is to be moving your crops around and allowing the soil to have a diverse plant partner each season or each year. The other thing that this chart allows you to do is to start to get a bit of a handle on the timing. So we know, because tomatoes are tropical plants, they're heat lovers, they are very, very sensitive to cold and frost. And so and of course we know the May 4 weekend, up here where I am, we actually wait until June 1st, because we a couple of years ago had a June 1st frost, which was pretty devastating for everyone that had put their tomatoes in a week earlier. And so for the spring, we know that those tomatoes are not going to be in that bed 3, so we're going to leave that section open. But we know that as soon, June 1st, the summer starting, we're putting those tomatoes in. And we also know that tomatoes can grow fairly late into the fall. Of course, it does depend on what kind of fall weather we're having. If we get an early frost, then we have to protect them in that case. But a tomato crop is a crop that we would consider to be in place for both the summer and the fall season. All right, next. So next crop that I wanted to slot in was cauliflower. And I've partially done that because cauliflower is a little bit finicky. It is a brassica, type of brassica plant, so it falls into the grouping with kale and Brussels sprouts and broccoli. And all brassicas are, in fact, the type of plant that prefers cool weather. And so the cauliflower here really is going to do best in the spring and in the fall in terms of the ideal temperatures that it can happily withstand. Now, you'll see, however, I have slotted the cauliflower into a summer location in bed 1. So if you've been paying attention, perhaps you'll recall that we have that big deciduous maple tree at the corner of bed 1. And so what that means is that by summer, when that high heat is out, that deciduous tree is going to be shading the spring cauliflower that was planted there, and is actually going to change the microclimate of that garden bed such that the cauliflower will remain happy in that particular location. And it will be getting it'll be getting less light than it was in the spring. So the growth likely will slow. However, that shade is really going to prevent it from getting too hot. It's going to prevent the soil from getting too hot. It's going to help hold the moisture in, which also helps to keep it cooler. And ultimately, we should be able to grow cauliflower in that space through the summer. If needed, we could always amend with an additional shade cover, which is a type of cloth. You can certainly buy them, or you can just find one that fits your needs. It's usually like a gauze, so that it allows a lot of light through. And in fact, they have different ratings, which is based on how much light the gauze lets through. And that's another option. So if it looked like the cauliflower, or we were having, well, which we probably will, one of those summers where it's incredibly hot and dry and incredibly hot, then chances are I'm going to put a cover over that as well. Okay, so then I went to start making my, I wanted to put my winter squash in. And all of a sudden I realized that I didn't want my cauliflower over in bed 3, and that instead what I was going to do was have that cauliflower in the fall, and I was actually going to be able to continue to grow it into the fall in bed 1. So this is one of those examples where as you're starting to work on it, you realize some of the opportunities that exist. So a really good tip here, and this goes for a lot of things, is do not wait to start laying out your plan or laying out your project until you feel you have all the answers, or you have all the knowledge, or you already have a pretty good idea of exactly how everything's going to look. That is a really truly amateur move, because it's only when we start putting pen on paper and really visualizing and manipulating these factors in a tangible way that we can truly start to see where things fit together well, and then perhaps where things there's going to be challenges, or what we thought might work well won't. So in this case, I realized, okay, I can move my cauliflower over to my bed 1. And the other thing I realized in putting my winter squash was that, first of all, I knew I could not put my winter squash in the top of bed 2. So for me, that was something I always look for when I first look to where to put my plants, is I want to see where was that type of plant last year. So the winter squash last year was in the top half of bed 2. So right away, I know that the top half of bed 2 is off limits for winter squash this year. The other thing I know about winter squash is that, like I mentioned, you put it out in the summer, and it does need to stay in place well into almost into the winter. Like I said, at least until after the first frost. So for example, I knew that I needed that winter squash to be somewhere that it could be allowed to take up a lot of room. They do like a lot of space. They have huge leaves, and they sort of just land and expand. And but also I knew we needed it somewhere where it wasn't going to get trampled, or there wasn't another crop that was going to come in the fall. And with bed 1 in particular, because it is partial sun, it is not ideal in the fall for a lot of other crops. So the winter squash was a really good fit there. The other thing this allowed me to anticipate by putting the winter squash there is that I know it is a heavy feeder. I know it likes to have a lot of nitrogen in the soil. And therefore, by putting the winter squash in the bottom half of bed 1, I could automatically then pencil in an amendment or some regenerative technique that I'm going to use in the bottom of bed 1 during the spring to boost up those nitrogen levels, so that they are ready and waiting to really make that winter squash happy once it goes in. So this is sort of the finer finesse of what using a chart system like this allows you to start to do. Is you're not only looking at where a particular plant is going to grow and when, but then you're also assessing what do you need to do the season before that to create the best possible growing conditions for that particular type of crop. Okay, so then the next crop that I selected was the watermelon. And I was really excited about this because I realized that watermelons can be trellised. In fact, it is considered to be a best practice to raise your melons off the ground, because they can be very susceptible to degradation, to insects. And if they're hanging from the vine, then they're much safer. Also, of course, to pests of all kinds. And now, eventually, often if you're done really well, you may have to put some netting in place to allow for some support, and to ensure that basically the vine doesn't fall down under the weight of that watermelon. But what's really cool here is that having that watermelon trellis is going to ensure that it's not going to be encroaching on those tomato plants, because again, we know melons, they're vining, they like to land and expand. So this way, if we're directing it upwards instead of outwards, it's not going to get intertwined with our tomato plants, who need lots of airflow to be very happy. All right, so time to put in the cucumbers now. I really like growing cucumbers. I've had really successful yields, and then I've had really terrible yields. It's one of those plants you really, for me at least, I'm never really sure what's going to happen. I know it does depend. There's so many different varieties out there, and the nice thing is cucumbers are more adaptive, I would say, than other plants. They are a heat crop, so they do like it warmer. But there are certain types that can be grown in the cooler ends of the season. So I'm excited. I'm going to grow cucumbers all season in bed too. Although I'm likely going to be, well, I'm definitely going to be using different species. And in fact, this is what I figured out next, was that I can interplant different types of cucumbers through the spring, summer, and fall in that particular bed, and then trellis them up. So again, I'm going to have more space by using a vertical opportunity in that particular bed. And what that will also do will be ensure that I have a cucumber harvest for a longer time, because with cucumbers, in my experience at least, you can have a really bang up crop, but it may only be for a week or two, and then you're out of luck for the rest of the season. So I've learned that if you grow a few different varieties, and then if you also plant them staggered through the season, then you can in fact be enjoying cucumbers for a much longer time. And then of course you'll have different types of cucumbers if you do pickling and that type of thing as well. All right, so as you saw there, we've pretty much got most of our garden space filled up. There's definitely still some empty spots. Oh, and I will also draw your attention to bed 2 at the bottom, where I slotted in garlic. So I mentioned that garlic is always a really great crop to add on to whatever else you're growing. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, it's incredibly easy to grow. It takes very little maintenance or resources. So, really good bang for your buck there. Even better bang for your buck because garlic actually has 2 crops. It does create the garlic scapes is what they're called. And they grow out of the middle of the garlic stalk. That's what you see me doing there. And then they're ready after they've done one round of a corkscrew, and you can actually just pull them out. And that's usually late June that you're able to harvest those. And then your garlic has about 4 to 6 weeks more in the ground, and then your garlic bulbs will be ready as well. So you're getting 2 crops out of garlic. Most importantly, why I love growing garlic is because it fills spots with something that otherwise it's often hard to fill those spots. And that's because garlic is an overwintering crop. And along with onions, other than onions, there's not a lot of overwintering crops, or not a lot of easy overwintering crops, let's say. So in fact, garlic gets planted in the late fall, or mid to late fall, and then it sits dormant over the winter, and then it comes up in the spring, and then is harvested in the summer. So it is actually often one of your earlier harvests, which makes it another great reason, because if you're growing only tropical plants or food, then you're going to be waiting until the middle of August and sometimes that can be a little bit frustrating. So garlic is ready to go, starting in June. And so garlic's a really good option in terms of being able to anticipate where the garlic and where the beds are going to have empty space. And as we've talked about in other sessions, we really want to avoid having empty slots. So we've got some interesting starburst arrows going on here. So I'm not sure how that happened, but bear with me here. And so you have a few empty slots left in your plan or on your chart. So the first thing I would say is leafy greens are a great option for any spring or fall. Oops, that should say spring or fall, not spring or summer. Spring or fall locations with full sun, or summer locations that have partial shade. Now, like any plant, when there's less sun, they grow more slowly. However, in this case, leafy greens are cold weather crops, and therefore they do not like too much heat, and a summer partial shade position will prevent too much heat, so you'll still get some yield. Now, who was it? Suzanne asked earlier about pak choi or bok choy. Either spelling is fine from what I understand. And bok choy is a type of leafy green in the sense that it is a cool weather crop, and it really loves to grow. It loves to be seeded when it's really only just a few degrees above zero, and it can grow in that early spring period if it has a little bit of cover. So for me, growing bok choy is seeding and growing bok choy is the first thing that I put in our hoop house as soon as it's warm enough. Frankly, probably could have had some growing in there, these last few weeks, but that's another story. So bok choy and green onions, those are the two things that I put in as soon as looks like we're going to have a stretch of warmer above zero weather, the soil isn't frozen, or if I have the ability to make a little greenhouse structure. And both of those crops are also very rapidly growing crops. So they're satisfying in terms of you're only looking at a couple of weeks from seeding to being able to harvest them. The disappointing thing, especially about bok choy, is that you'll get a couple good rounds in that sort of early March into perhaps April period, and then you go in one day and they're pretty much all dead. And what has happened there is essentially gotten too hot. So again, a bok choy or a green onion, they really like it to be very cool. More your salad greens are generally, and it depends on the type. There's a special type of salad leafy green called deer tongue, which is actually a heat leafy green. It can handle a lot more heat. But generally leafy greens they don't want it to be too cold, but they definitely don't want it to be too hot. So they're a good interim plant, and they also take up a lot of space. They have a lot of foliage, so they're going to protect the soil and prevent it from being bare. The next step is to look at which flowers you'd like to put in for pest control. And again, as I mentioned, there's some that are very commonly used, and then there's others that can be picked and choose for particular problems. And so marigolds are often ones that are used and have a bunch of really nice benefits, and of course they look beautiful as well. At that point, I'm then looking at which herbs I want to use to fill in, and again, this is an example where if you kind of need to have done your research, but basil really loves being planted with tomatoes. It really helps. They work incredibly well together synergistically. And so I'll always try and throw in some basil plants at the base of my tomatoes, and then be able to harvest that through the season. And then also be confident that they're not going to get too big or bushy, so as to interfere with that important airflow that the tomatoes needs. Last but not least, you're then sort of trying to anticipate, do I still have any bare space left? Is there going to be any soil exposed? We know we don't want it to be exposed. So then we're looking at any low-lying ground cover, any quick growing herbs like chives are great. They'll come up and you can eat them, or simply allow them to be roots in the ground, feeding the microbes. Or if for that particular space, let's say it's a spring space and it's let's say very shady, so you couldn't grow a leafy green in the spring, and then the tomatoes are coming in the summer, so our bed 3 in this example, you would want to have a backup plan in place, probably a mulch that you're going to want to use, so that soil is not bare and exposed through that sort of March, April, May time period. And then you would just plant into that mulch when you're ready to move your tomatoes in. All right, so we're just about here, and then I'm going to take some questions. For regenerative growing, one of the best practices is to maximize the number of perennial plants you have. There's a variety of reasons for that, but the most important one is that because perennial plants are living from year to year to year, what it means is that their roots are always in the ground, they're providing protection and cover, and most importantly, they're providing that food, that carbohydrate food, for the microorganisms in the soil. So it is where it's challenging because a perennial, you plant it and you have to leave it. So one of the recommendations I have there is, if you are using garden beds, to plant them in the corners or potentially right in the middle, where you're going to be a little bit less encumbered in terms of having to work around them. We already talked about growing legumes in an area where we're going to be growing a heavy feeder. Of course, another additional option is always to add a microbial input. So like some of the products that we sell, looking for my bag, there it is. So our worm manure product, if for whatever reason you're having to plant things in the same space because you're short on ability to move around, or if you're working with new soil that's degraded, or you simply just know that your plant didn't do well there last year, so something was missing, then a worm manure product like ours is going to kickstart that microbial ecosystem and replace whatever plant partners are missing, so that when you do get your plant into that space, they're going to have immediate access to the pizza delivery boys that they need to grow healthy and strong. And I already mentioned about climbing crops. Don't forget that you can always get them to grow vertically. I did want to quickly mention that similar principles can be applied to indoor space or to ornamental plants. And really what it comes down to is that you do want to group together plants that are from similar bioregions or similar climates. So you want to have a group of tropical plants in the same container. But what's really important to understand is, we often think one plant, one container for indoor plants, and that is in fact not the case. Indoor plants are just the same as outdoor plants. They want to be working with their microbial partners. They want to be sharing resources with other members of their plant family, friends. So actually putting multiple different species in the same container, as long as you take into account, the bioregion that they're from, and then the general properties that they like. So you wouldn't want to put a moisture-loving plant with a cactus, for example, because neither will be particularly happy. Whatever the moisture, one or the other will always not be happy with the moisture level. And then there is a little exception to that rule, which is that if you have a really low light plant, which often a lot of the tropical plants, because they grow in the understory, are low light, you can actually plant it with some taller partial light plants that are going to provide that shade to the low light plant. So again, thinking about the different physical characteristics that you can put to use, both indoors and of course for ornamental plants as well. Okay, so this will be your homework for next week. Which, let's say 4 or 5 primary plants or crops do you want to grow? And are any of them heavy feeders, because you want to anticipate and be prepared? And then of course, if you can, thinking back to what grew where last year and incorporating that into your plan as well. And we have our discount. So we've been talking about plant partners today, and we have a very specific living mulch kit that works on this principle. So this has the plant partners oats and peas that work really well together. And this is considered a living mulch or a green manure. So this is what I would be planting in the spring in advance of putting in my heavy feeder squash or corn or tomatoes, because 2 reasons. The first is that because those heavy feeders won't be able to go in until the summer, I want to have roots in the ground. I want that space, that soil covered in the spring. And this kit can be used as soon as the soil is no longer frozen. And the benefits are that the oats will come up very quickly. Within about a week, the oats germinate and start coming up. They're getting the roots into the ground, feeding the microbes. They're also helping with erosion and soil protection very quickly. And then the peas, which take a couple of weeks, they will in fact start coming up. And that's where we're getting all that nitrogen fixing. So that's a legume plant. They're able to transform nitrogen. And it's really once you, the technical term for this cover, to end a cover crop is to terminate it. So we would terminate this cover crop a couple of weeks before we're going to transplant into that space, because what we want to do is we want the peas to start to compost, because that's when most of the nitrogen that they've been able to transform is then released into the soil. So a little bit is when they're growing, but most of it comes after they start to degrade. So that's an important point. So today the discount, and then of course you get your worm manure as well. And we're offering free shipping on this product. So normally there would be a shipping fee, but until 11:59 tonight, you can use the discount code partners, and you will be able to get this product and not have to meet the minimum shipping threshold for free shipping. So that is that. All right, so we already talked about homework. Don't forget to sign up for the newsletter. This is not next week's topic because that was this week's topic. So we'll have to look at the sheet. And why don't we flip into Q&A? Kat, could you set us up with some questions, please?
Sure. So we had a question from Sue asking about native flowers that work well with vegetables. So I answered in the chat my favorite ones that she says she already has, which are black-eyed Susans and pale purple coneflower, wild bergamot, catnip, and Michigan lily.
Well, I'm glad you beat me to that one because, well, maybe some of you know, Kat is much better versed on the natives, the native plants than I am. Kat is in fact an herbalist. She's been trained and is also very passionate about indigenous plants. So I'm glad you were able to answer that one, because I may have come up with black-eyed Susan, but it probably would have ended there.
Okay, thank you. And then we have Jenny, we touched on companions for pests. Will we be touching on pollinator helpers for our flower plants like cucumbers?
Oh, that's a great question. I believe that Kat, maybe you can double check one, but I'm quite sure that we did have a session lined up a little bit later on in the season where we're talking about pollinator plants. I know we wanted to talk about wildflowers. It is. What day is that scheduled? Do you have that in front of you?
Yeah, let me just double check. So pollinators on Wednesday, April 10th.
Awesome. So Wednesday, April 10th, mark your calendar. We will be discussing which pollinator plants. And of course, it is so important to have those pollinator plants in your growing space, because many of our favorite fruits and vegetables do require pollination, that there are male and female flowers, and that if the pollinators aren't there to transfer the genetic material and cross-pollinate, then you're not getting the fruit. And in fact, that's the one of the big concerns, that given that we're losing a lot of our pollinators, is that the yields are going down. So it's certainly in your best interest to be able to have some of those in and interspersed with your other plants. But it was a good point. I think it should have been incorporated, or at least touched on today, as something important. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yes, thank you. And then another question from Sue. I'm ripping out all of my sod in the front yard. Yes, woo! And converting to garden. Great job. Do I need to prep the soil?
So one thing to understand about, well, so there's a few caveats. The first would be if you know how that sod has been treated in the past, because certainly with lawns, we always know there's a very good chance that chemicals have been used. And if that is the case, then that microbiome or that microbiology in that soil is going to be in rough shape. So certainly, if that were the case, you'd want to be working extra hard to amend it with a microbial food, and also, really getting all your regenerative techniques into effect as quickly as possible. The other thing I will note is that most grasses can tend to be bacterial. So especially, for example, if the lawn was rototilled a lot, and also because of the lack of diversity. So what that means is that the soil may be well suited for plants that prefer bacterially dominated or entirely bacterial soil. Brassicas are a group of plant that actually dislike fungi. Which is very unusual. Most plants need some fungal partners, but brassicas, because they were actually one of the first types of plants to develop on land. They sort of were the first to come out of the ocean, and therefore they sort of have this very unique mechanism by which they don't need fungi and they don't like fungi, and they only want to work with a bacterial soil, which is like an early succession soil. And succession is this idea that new ecosystem, there's water, and then we get early ecosystems that then transform over time to like a coniferous forest. And so what's important to understand is that your lawn is likely going to be bacterially dominated, which means that your brassicas could do well. A lot of other crops are going to be okay. You may want to look at amending with some mycorrhiza, again, especially if there's been chemicals. But certainly, if you're you may be challenged to put in later succession types plants, which are generally perennial plants, and shrubs and trees. So that might not be your best bet for your first season. It might be something you'd want to work up to, or at least really manage the fungal levels, because all of those later succession plants need more or less an equal bacterial to fungal ratio in their soil to be successful.
Thanks. That was
Oh, Ginny
all
left her
questions.
microphone. Any more questions?
No more questions.
No more questions. Okay. Well, we'll call it there. Thank you, everyone. We're over time anyway, so really appreciate you joining us. And have an excellent week. We'll see you next week. Bye now.